Chapter 1 of Father Goriot. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Bruce Peary. Father Goriot by Honore de Balzac. Translated by Ellen Marriage. Chapter 1. Madame Vauquer, née de Conflans, is an elderly person who for the past 40 years has kept a lodging-house in the Rue Neuve Sainte Geneviève, in the district that lies between the Latin Quarter and the Faubourg Saint-Marcel. Her house, known in the neighborhood as the Maison Vauquer, receives men and women, old and young, and no word has ever been breathed against her respectable establishment. But at the same time it must be said that, as a matter of fact, no young woman has been under her roof for 30 years, and that if a young man stays there for any length of time, it is a sure sign that his allowance must be of the slenderest. In 1819, however, the time when this drama opens, there was an almost penniless young girl among Madame Vauquer's boarders. That word, drama, has been somewhat discredited of late. It has been overworked and twisted to strange uses in these days of dolorous literature. But it must do service again here, not because this story is dramatic in the restricted sense of the word, but because some tears may perhaps be shed intra et extramuros before it is over. Will any one without the walls of Paris understand it? It is open to doubt. The only audience who could appreciate the results of close observation, the careful reproduction of minute detail and local color, are dwellers between the heights of Montrouge and Montmartre, in a vale of crumbling stucco, watered by streams of black mud, a vale of sorrows which are real, and joys too often hollow. But this audience is so accustomed to terrible sensations that only some unimaginable and well-nigh impossible woe could produce any lasting impression there. Now and again there are tragedies so awful and so grand by reason of the complication of virtues and vices that bring them about, that egotism and selfishness are forced to pause and are moved to pity. But the impression that they receive is like a luscious fruit, soon consumed. Civilization, like the car of Juggernaut, is scarcely stayed perceptibly in its progress by a heart less easy to break than the others that lie in its course. This also is broken, and civilization continues on her course triumphant. And you, too, will do the like, you who with this book in your white hand will sink back among the cushions of your armchair, and say to yourself, "Perhaps this may amuse me." You will read the story of Father Goriot's secret woes, and, dining thereafter with an unspoiled appetite, will lay the blame of your insensibility upon the writer, and accuse him of exaggeration, of writing romances. Ah, once for all, this drama is neither a fiction nor a romance. All is true. So true that everyone can discern the elements of the tragedy in his own house, perhaps in his own heart. The lodging-house is Madame Vauquer's own property. It is still standing in the lower end of the Rue Neuve Sainte Geneviève, just where the road slopes so sharply down to the Rue de l'Arbalète that wheeled traffic seldom passes that way because it is so stony and steep. This position is sufficient to account for the silence prevalent in the streets, shut in between the dome of the Pantheon and the dome of the Val de Grâce, two conspicuous public buildings which give a yellowish tone to the landscape, and darken the whole district that lies beneath the shadow of their leaden-hued cupolas. In that district the pavements are clean and dry, there is neither mud nor water in the gutters, grass grows in the chinks of the walls. The most heedless passer-by feels the depressing influences of a place where the sound of wheels creates a sensation. There is a grim look about the houses, a suggestion of a jail about those high garden walls. A Parisian straying into a suburb apparently composed of lodging-houses and public institutions would see poverty and dullness, old age lying down to die, and joyous youth condemned to drudgery. It is the ugliest quarter of Paris, and it may be added, the least known. But before all things, the Rue Neuve Sainte Genevieve is like a bronze frame for a picture for which the mind cannot be too well prepared by the contemplation of sad hues and sober images. Even so, step by step, the daylight decreases, and the cicerone's droning voice grows hollower as the traveller descends into the catacombs. The comparison holds good. Who shall say which is more ghastly, the sight of the bleached skulls or of dried up human hearts? The front of the lodging-house is at right angles to the road, and looks out upon a little garden, so that you see the side of the house in section, as it were, from the Rue Neuve Sainte Genevieve. Beneath the wall of the house front there lies a channel, a fathom wide, paved with cobblestones, and beside it runs a gravelled walk bordered by geraniums and oleanders and pomegranates set in great blue and white glazed earthenware pots. Access into the gravelled walk is afforded by a door, above which the words Maison Vauquer may be read, and beneath, in rather smaller letters, lodgings for both sexes, etc. During the day, a glimpse into the garden is easily obtained through a wicket to which a bell is attached. On the opposite wall, at the further end of the gravelled walk, a green marble arch was painted, once upon a time, by a local artist, and in this semblance of a shrine, a statue representing Cupid is installed. A Parisian Cupid, so blistered and disfigured that he looks like a candidate for one of the adjacent hospitals, and might suggest an allegory to lovers of symbolism. The half-obliterated inscription on the pedestal beneath determines the date of this work of art, for it bears witness to the widespread enthusiasm felt for Voltaire on his return to Paris in 1777. "Whoever thou art, thy master see. He is, or was, or ought to be." At night, the wicket gate is replaced by a solid door. The little garden is no wider than the front of the house. It is shut in between the wall of the street and the partition wall of the neighboring house. A mantle of ivy conceals the bricks and attracts the eyes of passers-by to an effect which is picturesque in Paris, for each of the walls is covered with trellised vines that yield a scanty, dusty crop of fruit, and furnish besides a subject of conversation for Madame Vauquer and her lodgers. Every year the widow trembles for her vintage. A straight path beneath the walls on either side of the garden leads to a clump of lime trees at the further end of it. Line trees, as Madame Vauquer persists in calling them, in spite of the fact that she was a de Conflans, and regardless of repeated corrections from her lodgers. The central space between the walls is filled with artichokes and rows of pyramid fruit trees, and surrounded by a border of lettuce, potherbs, and parsley. Under the lime trees there are a few green-painted garden seats and a wooden table, and hither, during the dog days, such of the lodgers as are rich enough to indulge in a cup of coffee come to take their pleasure, though it is hot enough to roast eggs even in the shade. The house itself is 3 stories high, without counting the attics under the roof. It is built of rough stone, and covered with the yellowish stucco that gives a mean appearance to almost every house in Paris. There are 5 windows in each story in the front of the house. All the blinds visible through the small square panes are drawn up awry, so that the lines are all at cross purposes. At the side of the house there are but 2 windows on each floor, and the lowest of all are adorned with a heavy iron grating. Behind the house a yard extends for some 20 feet, a space inhabited by a happy family of pigs, poultry, and rabbits. The woodshed is situated on the further side, and on the wall between the woodshed and the kitchen window hangs the meat safe, just above the place where the sink discharges its greasy streams. The cook sweeps all the refuse out through a little door into the Rue Neuve Sainte Genevieve, and frequently cleanses the yard with copious supplies of water under pain of pestilence. The house might have been built on purpose for its present uses. Access is given by a French window to the first room on the ground floor, a sitting room which looks out upon the street through the two barred windows already mentioned. Another door opens out of it into the dining room, which is separated from the kitchen by the well of the staircase, the steps being constructed partly of wood, partly of tiles, which are colored and beeswaxed. Nothing can be more depressing than the sight of that sitting room. The furniture is covered with horsehair woven in alternate dull and glossy stripes. There is a round table in the middle, with a purplish red marble top, on which there stands, by way of ornament, the inevitable white china tea service, covered with a half-effaced gilt network. The floor is sufficiently uneven, the wainscot rises to elbow height, and the rest of the wall space is decorated with a varnished paper, on which the principal scenes from Télémaque are depicted, the various classical personages being colored. The subject between the two windows is the banquet given by Calypso to the son of Ulysses, displayed thereon for the admiration of the boarders, and has furnished jokes these 40 years to the young men who show themselves superior to their position, by making fun of the dinners to which poverty condemns them. The hearth is always so clean and neat that it is evident that a fire is only kindled there on great occasions. The stone chimney-piece is adorned by a couple of vases filled with faded artificial flowers, imprisoned under glass shades, on either side of a bluish marble clock in the very worst taste. The first room exhales an odor for which there is no name in the language, and which should be called the odeur de pension. The damp atmosphere sends a chill through you as you breathe it. It has a stuffy, musty, and rancid quality. It permeates your clothing. After-dinner scents seem to be mingled in it with smells from the kitchen and scullery and the reek of a hospital. It might be possible to describe it if someone should discover a process by which to distill from the atmosphere all the nauseating elements with which it is charged by the catarrhal exhalations of every individual lodger, young or old. Yet, in spite of these stale horrors, the sitting-room is as charming and as delicately perfumed as a boudoir when compared with the adjoining dining-room. The panelled walls of that apartment were once painted some color, now a matter of conjecture, for the surface is encrusted with accumulated layers of grimy deposit, which cover it with fantastic outlines. A collection of dim-ribbed glass decanters, metal discs with a satin sheen on them, and piles of blue-edged earthenware plates of Touraine ware, cover the sticky surfaces of the sideboards that line the room. In the corner stands a box containing a set of numbered pigeon-holes, in which the lodgers' table napkins, more or less soiled and stained with wine, are kept. Here you see that indestructible furniture never met with elsewhere, which finds its way into lodging-houses, much as the wrecks of our civilization drift into hospitals for incurables. You expect in such places as these to find the weather-house whence a capuchin issues on wet days. You look to find the execrable engravings which spoil your appetite, framed every one in a black varnished frame, with a gilt beading round it. You know the sort of tortoise-shell clock-case inlaid with brass, the green stove, the argand lamps, covered with oil and dust, have met your eyes before. The oilcloth which covers the long table is so greasy that a waggish externe will write his name on the surface, using his thumbnail as a style. The chairs are broken-down invalids. The wretched little hempen mats slip away from under your feet without slipping away for good. And finally, the foot-warmers are miserable wrecks, hingeless, charred, broken away about the holes. It would be impossible to give an idea of the old, rotten, shaky, cranky, worm-eaten, halt, maimed, one-eyed, rickety, and ramshackle condition of the furniture, without an exhaustive description, which would delay the progress of the story to an extent that impatient people would not pardon. The red tiles of the floor are full of depressions brought about by scouring and periodical renewings of color. In short, there is no illusory grace left to the poverty that reigns here. It is dire, parsimonious, concentrated, threadbare poverty. As yet it has not sunk into the mire, it is only splashed by it, and though not in rags as yet, its clothing is ready to drop to pieces. This apartment is in all its glory at 7 o'clock in the morning, when Madame Vauquer's cat appears, announcing the near approach of his mistress, and jumps upon the sideboards to sniff at the milk in the bowls, each protected by a plate, while he purrs his morning greeting to the world. A moment later the widow shows her face. She is tricked out in a net cap attached to a false front set on awry, and shuffles into the room in her slipshod fashion. She is an oldish woman, with a bloated countenance, and a nose like a parrot's beak set in the middle of it. Her fat little hands, she is as sleek as a church rat, and her shapeless slouching figure are in keeping with the room that reeks of misfortune, where hope is reduced to speculate for the meanest stakes. Madame Vauquer alone can breathe that tainted air without being disheartened by it. Her face is as fresh as a frosty morning in autumn. There are wrinkles about the eyes that vary in their expression from the set smile of a ballet dancer to the dark, suspicious scowl of a discounter of bills. In short, she is at once the embodiment and interpretation of her lodging-house, as surely as her lodging-house implies the existence of its mistress. You can no more imagine the one without the other than you can think of a jail without a turnkey. The unwholesome corpulence of the little woman is produced by the life she leads, just as typhus fever is bred in the tainted air of a hospital. The very knitted woolen petticoat that she wears beneath a skirt made of an old gown, with the wadding protruding through the rents in the material, is a sort of epitome of the sitting-room, the dining-room, and the little garden. It discovers the cook, it foreshadows the lodgers. The picture of the house is completed by the portrait of its mistress. Madame Vauquer, at the age of 50, is like all women who have seen a deal of trouble. She has the glassy eyes and innocent air of a trafficker in flesh and blood, who will wax virtuously indignant to obtain a higher price for her services, but who is quite ready to betray a Georges or a Pichegru, if a Georges or a Pichegru were in hiding and still to be betrayed, or for any other expedient that may alleviate her lot. Still, she is a good woman at bottom, said the lodgers, who believed that the widow was wholly dependent upon the money that they paid her, and sympathized when they heard her cough and groan like one of themselves. What had Monsieur Vauquer been? The lady was never very explicit on this head. How had she lost her money? Through trouble, was her answer. He had treated her badly, had left her nothing but her eyes to cry over his cruelty, the house she lived in, and the privilege of pitying nobody, because, so she was wont to say, she herself had been through every possible misfortune. Sylvie, the stout cook, hearing her mistress's shuffling footsteps, hastened to serve the lodgers' breakfasts. Besides those who lived in the house, Madame Vauquer took boarders who came for their meals, but these externes usually only came to dinner, for which they paid 30 francs a month. At the time when this story begins, the lodging-house contained 7 inmates. The best rooms in the house were on the first story, Madame Vauquer herself occupying the least important, while the rest were let to a Madame Couture, the wife of a commissary general in the service of the Republic. With her lived Victorine Taillefer, a schoolgirl to whom she filled the place of mother. These 2 ladies paid 1,800 francs a year. The 2 sets of rooms on the second floor were respectively occupied by an old man named Poiret and a man of 40 or thereabouts, the wearer of a black wig and dyed whiskers, who gave out that he was a retired merchant, and was addressed as Monsieur Vautrin. Two of the 4 rooms on the 3rd floor were also let, one to an elderly spinster, Mademoiselle Michonneau, and the other to a retired manufacturer of vermicelli, Italian paste, and starch, who allowed the others to address him as Father Goriot. The remaining rooms were allotted to various birds of passage, to impecunious students, who, like Father Goriot and Mademoiselle Michonneau, could only muster 45 francs a month to pay for their board and lodging. Madame Vauquer had little desire for lodgers of this sort; they ate too much bread, and she only took them in default of better. At that time, one of the rooms was tenanted by a law student, a young man from the neighborhood of Angouleme, one of a large family who pinched and starved themselves to spare 1,200 francs a year for him. Misfortune had accustomed Eugène de Rastignac, for that was his name, to work. He belonged to the number of young men who know as children that their parents' hopes are centred on them, and deliberately prepare themselves for a great career, subordinating their studies from the first to this end, carefully watching the indications of the course of events, calculating the probable turn that affairs will take, that they may be the first to profit by them. But for his observant curiosity, and the skill with which he managed to introduce himself into the salons of Paris, this story would not have been colored by the tones of truth, which it certainly owes to him, for they are entirely due to his penetrating sagacity and desire to fathom the mysteries of an appalling condition of things, which was concealed as carefully by the victim as by those who had brought it to pass. Above the 3rd story there was a garret where the linen was hung to dry, and a couple of attics. Christophe, the man of all work, slept in one, and Sylvie, the stout cook, in the other. Beside the 7 inmates thus enumerated, taking one year with another, some 8 law or medical students dined in the house, as well as 2 or 3 regular comers who lived in the neighborhood. There were usually 18 people at dinner, and there was room, if need be, for 20 at Madame Vauquer's table. At breakfast, however, only the 7 lodgers appeared. It was almost like a family party. Every one came down in dressing gown and slippers, and the conversation usually turned on anything that had happened the evening before. Comments on the dress or appearance of the dinner contingent were exchanged in friendly confidence. These 7 lodgers were Madame Vauquer's spoiled children. Among them she distributed, with astronomical precision, the exact proportion of respect and attention due to the varying amounts they paid for their board. One single consideration influenced all these human beings thrown together by chance. The 2 second-floor lodgers only paid 72 francs a month. Such prices as these are confined to the Faubourg Saint-Marcel and the district between La Bourbe and the Salpêtrière. And, as might be expected, poverty, more or less apparent, weighed upon them all, Madame Couture being the sole exception to the rule. The dreary surroundings were reflected in the costumes of the inmates of the house. All were alike threadbare. The color of the men's coats were problematical. Such shoes in more fashionable quarters are only to be seen lying in the gutter. The cuffs and collars were worn and frayed at the edges. Every limp article of clothing looked like the ghost of its former self. The women's dresses were faded, old-fashioned, dyed and re-dyed. They wore gloves that were glazed with hard wear, much mended lace, dingy ruffles, crumpled muslin fichus. So much for their clothing, but for the most part their frames were solid enough. Their constitutions had weathered the storms of life. Their cold, hard faces were worn like coins that have been withdrawn from circulation, but there were greedy teeth behind the withered lips. Dramas brought to a close or still in progress are foreshadowed by the sight of such actors as these, not the dramas that are played before the footlights and against a background of painted canvas, but dumb dramas of life, frost-bound dramas that sear hearts like fire, dramas that do not end with the actors' lives. Mademoiselle Michonneau, that elderly young lady, screened her weak eyes from the daylight by a soiled green silk shade with a rim of brass, an object fit to scare away the angel of pity himself. Her shawl, with its scanty draggled fringe, might have covered a skeleton, so meagre and angular was the form beneath it. Yet she must have been pretty and shapely once. What corrosive had destroyed the feminine outlines? Was it trouble or vice or greed? Had she loved too well? Had she been a second-hand clothes dealer, a frequenter of the back stairs of great houses, or had she been merely a courtesan? Was she expiating the flaunting triumphs of a youth overcrowded with pleasures by an old age in which she was shunned by every passer-by? Her vacant gaze sent a chill through you. Her shriveled face seemed like a menace. Her voice was like the shrill, thin note of the grasshopper sounding from the thicket when winter is at hand. She said that she had nursed an old gentleman, ill of catarrh of the bladder, and left to die by his children, who thought that he had nothing left. His bequest to her, a life annuity of 1,000 francs, was periodically disputed by his heirs, who mingled slander with their persecutions. In spite of the ravages of conflicting passions, her face retained some traces of its former fairness and fineness of tissue. Some vestiges of the physical charms of her youth still survived. Monsieur Poiret was a sort of automaton. He might be seen any day sailing like a gray shadow along the walks of the Jardin des Plantes. On his head a shabby cap, a cane with an old yellow ivory handle in the tips of his thin fingers. The outspread skirts of his threadbare overcoat failed to conceal his meagre figure. His breeches hung loosely on his shrunken limbs. The thin, blue-stockinged legs trembled like those of a drunken man. There was a notable breach of continuity between the dingy white waistcoat and crumpled shirt frills and the cravat twisted about a throat like a turkey gobbler's. Altogether, his appearance set people wondering whether this outlandish ghost belonged to the audacious race of the sons of Japhet who flutter about on the Boulevard Italien. What devouring kind of toil could have so shriveled him? What devouring passions had darkened that bulbous countenance, which would have seemed outrageous as a caricature? What had he been? Well, perhaps he had been part of the machinery of justice, a clerk in the office to which the executioner sends in his accounts. So much for providing black veils for parricides, so much for sawdust, so much for pulleys and cord for the knife. Or he might have been a receiver at the door of a public slaughter-house, or a sub-inspector of nuisances. Indeed, the man appeared to have been one of the beasts of burden in our great social mill, one of those Parisian ratons whom their Bertrands do not even know by sight, a pivot in the obscure machinery that disposes of misery and things unclean, one of those men, in short, at sight of whom we are prompted to remark that, after all, we cannot do without them. Stately Paris ignores the existence of these faces bleached by moral or physical suffering, but then Paris is in truth an ocean that no line can plumb. You may survey its surface and describe it, but no matter how numerous and painstaking the toilers in this sea, there will always be lonely and unexplored regions in its depths, caverns unknown, flowers and pearls and monsters of the deep overlooked or forgotten by the divers of literature. The Maison Vauquer is one of these curious monstrosities. Two, however, of Madame Vauquer's boarders formed a striking contrast to the rest. There was a sickly pallor, such as is often seen in anemic girls, in Mademoiselle Victorine Taillefer's face, and her unvarying expression of sadness, like her embarrassed manner and pinched look, was in keeping with the general wretchedness of the establishment in the Rue Neuve Sainte Genevieve, which forms a background to this picture. But her face was young. There was youthfulness in her voice and elasticity in her movements. This young misfortune was not unlike a shrub newly planted in an uncongenial soil, where its leaves have already begun to wither. The outlines of her figure, revealed by her dress of the simplest and cheapest materials, were also youthful. There was the same kind of charm about her too slender form, her faintly colored face and light brown hair, that modern poets find in mediaeval statuettes, and a sweet expression, a look of Christian resignation in the dark gray eyes. She was pretty by force of contrast. If she had been happy, she would have been charming. Happiness is the poetry of woman, as the toilette is her tinsel. If the delightful excitement of a ball had made the pale face glow with color, if the delights of a luxurious life had brought the color to the wan cheeks that were slightly hollowed already, if love had put light into the sad eyes, then Victorine might have ranked among the fairest. But she lacked the two things which create woman a second time: pretty dresses and love letters. A book might have been made of her story. Her father was persuaded that he had sufficient reason for declining to acknowledge her, and allowed her a bare 600 francs a year. He had further taken measures to disinherit his daughter, and had converted all his real estate into personalty, that he might leave it undivided to his son. Victorine's mother had died broken-hearted in Madame Couture's house, and the latter, who was a near relation, had taken charge of the little orphan. Unluckily, the widow of the Commissary General to the Armies of the Republic had nothing in the world but her jointure and her widow's pension, and some day she might be obliged to leave the helpless, inexperienced girl to the mercy of the world. The good soul, therefore, took Victorine to mass every Sunday and to confession once a fortnight, thinking that, in any case, she would bring up her ward to be devout. She was right. Religion offered a solution of the problem of the young girl's future. The poor child loved the father who refused to acknowledge her. Once every year she tried to see him to deliver her mother's message of forgiveness, but every year hitherto she had knocked at that door in vain. Her father was inexorable. Her brother, her only means of communication, had not come to see her for 4 years, and had sent her no assistance. Yet she prayed to God to unseal her father's eyes and to soften her brother's heart, and no accusations mingled with her prayers. Madame Couture and Madame Vauquer exhausted the vocabulary of abuse, and failed to find words that did justice to the banker's iniquitous conduct; but while they heaped execrations on the millionaire, Victorine's words were as gentle as the moan of the wounded dove, and affection found expression even in the cry drawn from her by pain. Eugène de Rastignac was a thoroughly Southern type. He had a fair complexion, blue eyes, black hair. In his figure, manner, and his whole bearing, it was easy to see that he had either come of a noble family, or that, from his earliest childhood, he had been gently bred. If he was careful of his wardrobe, only taking last year's clothes into daily wear, still upon occasion he could issue forth as a young man of fashion. Ordinarily he wore a shabby coat and waistcoat, the limp black cravat untidily knotted that students affect, trousers that matched the rest of his costume, and boots that had been resoled. Vautrin, the man of 40 with the dyed whiskers, marked a transition stage between these two young people and the others. He was the kind of man that calls forth the remark, "He looks a jovial sort." He had broad shoulders, a well-developed chest, muscular arms, and strong, square-fisted hands. The joints of his fingers were covered with tufts of fiery red hair. His face was furrowed by premature wrinkles. There was a certain hardness about it, in spite of his bland and insinuating manner. His bass voice was by no means unpleasant, and was in keeping with his boisterous laughter. He was always obliging, always in good spirits. If anything went wrong with one of the locks, he would soon unscrew it, take it to pieces, file it, oil and clean and set it in order, and put it back in its place again. "I am an old hand at it," he used to say. Not only so, he knew all about ships, the sea, France, foreign countries, men, business, law, great houses, and prisons. There was nothing that he did not know. If any one complained rather more than usual, he would offer his services at once. He had several times lent money to Madame Vauquer or to the boarders, but somehow those whom he obliged felt that they would sooner face death than fail to repay him. A certain resolute look, sometimes seen on his face, inspired fear of him, for all his appearance of easy good nature. In the way he spat there was an imperturbable coolness which seemed to indicate that this was a man who would not stick at a crime to extricate himself from a false position. His eyes, like those of a pitiless judge, seemed to go to the very bottom of all questions, to read all natures, all feelings and thoughts. His habit of life was very regular. He usually went out after breakfast, returning in time for dinner, and disappeared for the rest of the evening, letting himself in about midnight with a latch key, a privilege that Madame Vauquer accorded to no other boarder. But then he was on very good terms with the widow. He used to call her mamma, and put his arm round her waist, a piece of flattery perhaps not appreciated to the full. The worthy woman might imagine this to be an easy feat, but, as a matter of fact, no arm but Vautrin's was long enough to encircle her. It was a characteristic trait of his generosity to pay 15 francs a month for the cup of coffee with a dash of brandy in it, which he took after dinner. Less superficial observers than young men engulfed by the whirlpool of Parisian life, or old men who took no interest in anything that did not directly concern them, would not have stopped short at the vaguely unsatisfactory impression that Vautrin made upon them. He knew or guessed the concerns of every one about him, but none of them had been able to penetrate his thoughts or to discover his occupation. He had deliberately made his apparent good nature, his unfailing readiness to oblige, and his high spirits into a barrier between himself and the rest of them, but not seldom he gave glimpses of appalling depths of character. He seemed to delight in scourging the upper classes of society with the lash of his tongue, to take pleasure in convicting it of inconsistency, in mocking at law and order with some grim jest worthy of Juvenal, as if some grudge against the social system rankled in him, as if there were some mystery carefully hidden away in his life. Mademoiselle Taillefer felt attracted, perhaps unconsciously, by the strength of the one man and the good looks of the other. Her stolen glances and secret thoughts were divided between them, but neither of them seemed to take any notice of her, although some day a chance might alter her position, and she would be a wealthy heiress. For that matter, there was not a soul in the house who took any trouble to investigate the various chronicles of misfortunes, real or imaginary, related by the rest. Each one regarded the others with indifference, tempered by suspicion. It was a natural result of their relative positions. Practical assistance not one could give; this they all knew, and they had long since exhausted their stock of condolence over previous discussions of their grievances. They were in something the same position as an elderly couple who have nothing left to say to each other. The routine of existence kept them in contact, but they were parts of a mechanism which wanted oil. There was not one of them but would have passed a blind man begging in the street, not one that felt moved to pity by a tale of misfortune, not one who did not see in death the solution of the all-absorbing problem of misery, which left them cold to the most terrible anguish in others. The happiest of these hapless beings was certainly Madame Vauquer, who reigned supreme over this hospital supported by voluntary contributions. For her, the little garden, which silence and cold and rain and drought combined to make as dreary as an Asian steppe, was a pleasant shaded nook. The gaunt yellow house, the musty odors of a back shop, had charms for her, and for her alone. Those cells belonged to her. She fed those convicts, condemned to penal servitude for life, and her authority was recognized among them. Where else in Paris would they have found wholesome food in sufficient quantity at the prices she charged them, and rooms which they were at liberty to make, if not exactly elegant or comfortable, at any rate clean and healthy? If she had committed some flagrant act of injustice, the victim would have borne it in silence. Such a gathering contained, as might have been expected, the elements out of which a complete society might be constructed. And, as in a school, as in the world itself, there was, among the 18 men and women who met round the dinner table, a poor creature despised by all the others, condemned to be the butt of all their jokes. At the beginning of Eugène de Rastignac's second 12-month, this figure suddenly started out into bold relief against the background of human forms and faces among which the law student was yet to live for another 2 years to come. This laughing stock was the retired vermicelli merchant, Father Goriot, upon whose face a painter, like the historian, would have concentrated all the light in his picture. How had it come about that the boarders regarded him with a half-malignant contempt? Why did they subject the oldest among their number to a kind of persecution, in which there was mingled some pity, but no respect for his misfortunes? Had he brought it on himself by some eccentricity or absurdity, which is less easily forgiven or forgotten than more serious defects? The question strikes at the root of many a social injustice. Perhaps it is only human nature to inflict suffering on anything that will endure suffering, whether by reason of its genuine humility or indifference or sheer helplessness. Do we not, one and all, like to feel our strength even at the expense of some one or of something? The poorest sample of humanity, the street Arab, will pull the bell handle at every street door in bitter weather, and scramble up to write his name on the unsullied marble of a monument. End of chapter 1.